Where are you today? We are saying our final goodbye to John, our son who passed away, and my husband didn't even show up for the funeral. I'm going to call him. When I did, his voice sounded cheerful. I'm in Bermuda for my parents' 30th anniversary, he said. My mom heard him, and at first, she was shocked, but then she got furious. They're in Bermuda? She screamed. Mom lost her patience and decided to confront my husband and his parents. My name is Mary. I'm 43 years old, and I work in an office. I married my husband, Larry, 13 years ago, and we have one son together. Our son, John, has been in the hospital. He was diagnosed with leukemia 4 years ago and has been there ever since. Even though he started elementary school, he couldn't go much. But sometimes his classmates would visit him, which made him so happy. Seeing John smile and fight so hard gives me strength. My parents also visit John every day. I can't wait for John to recover so we can go out and eat something yummy together. My mom says John has been so brave through his difficult treatments. My mom keeps going, being healthy, but my dad was diagnosed with dementia a few years ago, and sometimes he says things that don't make sense. When he came to see John the other day, he mistook me for a nurse and thanked me for looking after his grandson. It made me sad but also surprised that he hadn't forgotten about John. Even though he confuses things, he still knows that John is sick. My mom sighed and said, "It's obvious that Dad is worried about John." John understands, too. About dementia, when his grandpa says something strange, he just kindly goes along with it. While John's school friends and my parents are worried about him, my husband doesn't seem to care. I asked him, "Can't you come visit John? Aren't you worried that he's going through all these treatments?" But my husband said, "John doesn't like me, so it's probably best that I stay away because I'm too busy." Indeed, John and his father didn't get along. But, like his father, Larry should still try to be there for him. Larry never helped with John's care after he was born, so it's no surprise that John didn't like Larry. He seemed to care more about his parents than his son. Whenever he had free time, he would go to their house, saying he was busy helping them. My in-laws don't seem to care about John either. They barely visit him in the hospital. It's cold-hearted, not only from Larry but from his parents as well. My mom was upset with Larry and his parents' attitude. She complained with an especially upset, disapproving expression that my husband didn't come to see his son. I said, half joking, maybe I married the wrong person. He was so nice to me when we were dating, but now he's cold to both me and John. Even though our son is seriously ill, my husband seems to only care about his parents, and that's starting to bother me. My mom seemed to think I regretted marrying Larry. She looked at me sadly and said, "If I had known Larry was like that, I would have never introduced him to you. I feel like your uncle, who introduced you to Larry, had also cheated us. My husband and I met through my dad's brother. It seems my uncle and father-in-law knew each other, and when they talked about finding a wife for Larry, they mentioned my name. At the time, I wasn't dating anyone, so I decided to meet Larry casually. He seemed nice, and I liked him, but I wasn't ready to get married yet. However, he liked me and asked me to start dating seriously. Before I knew it, we were already getting married. My mom also noticed that Larry's parents changed completely after we got married. They used to seem humble, but after the wedding, they became completely different people. My mother-in-law, who used to always smile, suddenly became strict and spoke harshly to me, saying, "Mary, you are now part of this family, so you must do what I say. If you don't listen, we'll make sure you get a quick divorce." I thought my father-in-law was a quiet man, but he started making insulting comments like, "We only let you marry Mary because the head of our family introduced you. Otherwise, we would have never allowed someone like you to marry our son." He would say that every time there was a problem. My uncle owns a real estate company, and my father-in-law has a contract with it. When my uncle introduced me, he mentioned that I came from a wealthy family. Because of this, my father-in-law thought that my dad owned a lot of properties, which explained his comments. I hadn't heard any of this from my dad or my uncle, so I believed what my father-in-law said. After we got married, we moved into the house where my maternal grandparents used to live. My grandparents had passed away, and the house was empty, so we renovated it a bit and moved in. My family had considered renting the house out because leaving it empty could lead to it falling into disrepair. But when my husband found out about the empty house, he begged my parents, saying, "I promise we will take good care of it. Please let us live there. The house is close to my family, so we can also help take care of his parents." That made sense since I was also close to his family, and we could help both of them. However, having his parents around, especially after they changed so much after the wedding, became a burden on me. Plus, he would often invite his parents over to our house and start bragging, saying things like, "Our house is new." It must make them jealous. "It's a lot bigger, maybe even twice the size of theirs." He would talk like he owned the house. His father seemed upset, but his mother would smile and say, "We could live here together. It might be an old house, but it's better than where we live now." After they left, I asked my husband, "Are you planning on having your parents move in with us? This isn't even your house." My husband just laughed and said it was a joke. But even if he was joking, my mother-in-law seemed to take it seriously, which made me uneasy. After that, my father-in-law kept coming over, looking around the house, and saying how they wanted to live there. "It would be better than our poor house. At least there's no rent here," my father-in-law said. It made me upset that he called the house a dump, and my mother-in-law ignored me while she was picking out a room for herself. As my husband didn't say anything, I decided to tell them the truth. "We are borrowing this house from my parents. My grandparents used to live here, so of course it's a bit old." My in-laws were shocked to hear that, but then my father-in-law quickly responded with an angry look. "That's why it's in such bad condition." He called it poor, but I thought it was better than his house. My mother-in-law didn't seem to believe me and started saying whatever she wanted, asking, "Why are you lying? I trust my son more than you." Even though my mother-in-law didn't believe me, it didn't change the fact that we were borrowing the house, so I didn't argue any further. I was worried about what might happen if my in-laws tried to move in with us. But when I found out I was pregnant, the argument about them moving in stopped. Maybe they realized that they would have to help with the baby if they wanted to live with us, so all of a sudden, they went quiet. My mother-in-law said, "Mary's parents should take care of the baby since they live close by, so I won't have to." I never asked her to help with the baby, but she said it anyway. Since we lived close to both my parents and my in-laws, I kept thinking that she didn't want to help with the baby. I wondered how they could not be excited about their first grandchild. When I told my mom what my mother-in-law said, she just laughed and said, "Let me take care of the baby. You don't need to ask for help from someone who doesn't want to take care of your sweet grandson." I thought my mom was right and planned to ask her for help once the baby was born. After a while, when my son was born, my parents were overjoyed, but my in-laws only visited once. My husband also didn't seem excited about the birth of our son, which was disappointing. My mom tried to cheer me up, saying, "Don't worry. Once the baby comes, Larry will develop affection for him. Maybe he doesn't feel like a father yet." But my husband continued to show no interest in our son. Then, when our son turned 6, he got sick. After some tests at the hospital, he was diagnosed with childhood cancer. My husband, who was supposed to support me in that tough time, told me, "You will have to cover the medical expenses yourself." It's not my problem. I got angry at his attitude as a father. My mother-in-law also made cruel comments, saying, "It's because Mary passed on her genes that John has cancer. None of our relatives have anything like that, so it must be your fault." Hearing my husband's and mother-in-law's comments, my dad stood up and defended me, saying, "Don't worry, Mary. We will take care of him so they can do whatever they want." My dad, who was very supportive at that time, made my husband and father-in-law leave without saying anything else. Although I was already distressed about my son's illness, their cruel words made me feel even worse. My mom encouraged me, saying, "Don't be discouraged. You will be sad if you don't stay strong. We will do everything we can to support you. We will work together." Encouraged by my mother, I decided to stay strong for my son. I realized that I could not rely on my husband anymore, so I focused on taking care of my son and working. My parents, who were already retired, helped me take care of him, and I was very grateful to them. Although our son was diagnosed with childhood cancer, his condition improved, and he was able to live almost like a normal child. However, my husband started to question if our son had cancer and accused me of trying to deceive him. He would say things like, "Is John sick? Or are you trying to deceive me?" Seeing our son playing happily, my husband kept making inappropriate comments. I ignored him because talking to him seemed pointless. After the diagnosis, my husband wasn't home much. He spent a lot of time at his parents' house, which made things easier for me since all he did was complain. My parents would come over to help me with our son, which made my husband seem even less interested. But after our son was hospitalized 3 years ago, my husband started spending more time at home. He would say things like, "Leave the housework to me. You can go to the hospital, and then, by the way, how about you give me this house?" When I came back from the hospital, he would make these insinuations with a mocking smile. I would ignore him, but I could tell he was more worried about the house than our son. It bothered me to think about how he was planning on moving in with his parents, not caring about our son. Around that time, my dad was diagnosed with dementia, and both my mom and I were busy. So, we couldn't take care of the house. We hadn't explained my dad's condition to my husband or my in-laws. So even when my dad came over, my husband didn't seem to notice what was going on. "Your parents came over today, but they were just walking around. They're not going to help with John," my husband would say, acting indifferent. Since I couldn't take my dad out for a walk alone, my mom would always go with him. Explaining everything to my husband seemed too exhausting, so I didn't say anything. My uncle would also visit us from time to time, and I used to have serious conversations with my mother. I was curious about what they were talking about, as my uncle always looked very serious. When I asked my mom, she would just give me vague answers. Even though I was worried about my mom and uncle, my son's condition was getting worse. I was prepared for it, but seeing him in critical condition overwhelmed me. With my husband being unreliable and my father suffering from dementia, I had no choice but to depend on my mother. When I informed my husband about our son's critical condition, he told me something shocking. "I'm busy right now, so stop calling. You take care of John's situation." I was infuriated by his lack of responsibility as a parent, and I seriously considered separating from him. After a while, my son passed away. I was so shocked I couldn't do anything. My mother and uncle took care of everything, allowing me to stay by my son's side. Right before the funeral, my uncle started getting nervous, asking, "Where are Larry and his parents? They can't miss the funeral, right?" Seeing him so stressed, I called my husband and asked him, "Where are you? It's time to say goodbye to John." My husband replied, "I'm at a party celebrating my parents' anniversary. I told you not to call now." Hearing his voice over the phone, my mother and uncle were furious. My mother turned red with anger and said, "He's in Bermuda?" I didn't expect much from my husband, but finding out that he had gone on vacation to Bermuda while John was in critical condition made me lose my cool. "You knew John was in critical condition, and still, you went on a trip? I feel sorry for John for having a father like you," I told him before hanging up the phone. Holding back tears, my mother consoled me, saying, "I will never forgive them. Don't worry. Everything will be over by the time they get back from Bermuda." I was so confused by my anger and sadness that I didn't fully understand what my mother meant, but I knew I had to stay strong for my son. Thanks to my uncle and my mother, the funeral went off without a hitch. After the funeral, I felt lost. I had focused my life on my son, and now I didn't know what to do next. My uncle advised me, "Leave the future in my hands, Mary. You should go back to your parents' house and take it easy." Following his advice, I went back to my parents' house and started helping take care of my dad while I got my job settled. My employer was very understanding and allowed me to take a long break, which was a relief. When I had almost forgotten my husband, I got a call from him. "Mary, I can't get into the house. You changed the locks." Distressed, I replied, "I have not changed the locks. I am planning to end everything with you, so do not call me again," and I hung up. After a while, my husband called again, this time more frantic. "My parents' house has been demolished. What is going on? There's even a land for sale sign. I don't understand. What are you talking about?" I said, "I'm going to hang up and consult with my uncle." I ended the call. When I consulted with my uncle, he seemed satisfied and asked me to go to my in-laws' family house. I went as he instructed me to see what was going on. When I arrived, I found my husband and my in-laws there, looking shocked. My husband demanded, "What is going on? My parents' house has disappeared. You did it. Why don't we take you to Bermuda? You knocked down the house for that? Frustrated by my mother-in-law's confusing accusation, I replied, I would never do that. I had a funeral to attend. Just when the situation was becoming tense, my uncle and my mother arrived. My mother yelled, "People who didn't even attend the funeral have no right to complain. They should at least reflect on their actions." Larry and his parents were silent for a moment, but then my father-in-law started complaining, "You can't just demolish the house and sell the land. I am the owner of this property." Seeing my father-in-law's strange claims, I started to wonder if he might be suffering from dementia. He proudly presented a contract and said, "We got the house and land from your father. Here is the contract to prove it." The contract he showed had my father's signature on it, but it seemed suspiciously unofficial. Plus, it stated that the property was given away for free, which seemed impossible. This contract can't be valid. Plus, my father suffers from dementia and can't make rational decisions, I said. Larry's parents insisted the contract was valid, claiming they didn't know about my father's condition. Then my mother intervened. "This land is registered in my name, so he can't sign the contract. They knew my father suffered from dementia and forced him to sign, right?" I was shocked by my mother's words, but Larry and his parents were even more uneasy. My father-in-law refused to believe her. My uncle then showed everyone the details of the land and the lease agreement. The land and the building belonged to Mary's mother. "We had to terminate the lease because you were behind on rent payments, and we put the property up for sale. We tried several times to arrange meetings with you, but you ignored us. We had no choice but to take legal action," explained my uncle. Larry's parents stared at the documents in silence. My father-in-law asked, "Were they behind on the rent? Why didn't they pay?" My mother-in-law, looking confused, admitted, "I thought it was okay since we became related to your uncle." Then he revealed the truth. "We planned to trick your father into giving us the land, so we didn't think we needed to pay rent." I was shocked to find out about the unpaid rent, but I got even angrier when I realized they had planned to trick my father from the beginning. My anger was growing, and I was about to protest when Larry suddenly pulled out a contract. With a regretful expression, he asked my mother, "The house we live in is also yours. Does that mean this contract is also worthless?" The contract Larry was holding had my father's signature on it, just like the previous one. It seemed Larry had misinterpreted, believing that our house also belonged to my father, and created a fake contract. "It's ridiculous that they tried to trick us without even checking who was the owner of the land," my mother said in amazement, while Larry and his parents trembled with rage. My mother explained that her father was a major landowner in the area, including the surroundings of his home, which did not surprise Larry as much as it did me. Suddenly, a young woman appeared and demanded, "Please pay me the travel expenses that I covered. When will the life insurance of her deceased son be paid?" Upon seeing the woman, Larry became nervous. My uncle smiled and said, "Even after the death of your son, you took your mistress to Bermuda. You have outdone yourself." "We investigated everything." I was shocked again, but quickly realized the woman was Larry's mistress. It seemed my uncle suspected Larry of cheating on me and had been secretly investigating him. While my mother and uncle discussed the situation seriously, the woman, who had appeared at the worst possible time, quickly left. "I can't believe Larry was such a terrible person. Our son must be horrified from heaven," I said, but Larry seemed indifferent. After the appearance of his mistress, I turned to his parents and told them, "How does it feel to have enjoyed yourselves in Bermuda, hoping to rely on your grandson's insurance money? Sadly for you, I am the beneficiary of the insurance, so you will have to cover the trip expenses by yourselves." Unable to answer, Larry's parents rushed off. After the funeral, I realized my mother had planned to completely cut Larry and his parents out of our lives. After this, I divorced Larry and filed a lawsuit for alimony. It turned out my ex-husband had been cheating on me for 3 years and was planning to leave me after our son passed away. He believed that once our son passed, he would no longer have to pay support or deal with any responsibilities and that he would benefit from the life insurance. He even confessed his infidelity to his parents and took them on a trip to Bermuda. He knew about my father's dementia and took advantage of the situation by getting him to secretly sign a contract while our son was in critical condition. As my mother and I were busy taking care of our son, we left my father with a caregiver at home, which allowed my ex-husband to act. He managed to get my father to sign the contract as planned, but he didn't realize that the land belonged to my mother. My mother had inherited both properties from my grandfather and had entrusted the management of them to my uncle, who runs a real estate company. My father-in-law, who was renting the land and the property from my uncle, mistakenly thought they still belonged to my father. That mistake was a huge negligence. Without checking the details, my ex-husband and his parents focused solely on trying to get money. In the end, they accumulated a large amount of debt. Now, my ex-husband not only has to pay child support but also cover the costs of the family trip to Bermuda, which left him in a precarious financial situation. My in-laws were also required to pay back rent, and they turned to their son for help, but he could barely handle his debts. They hadn't paid rent before because they were already struggling with debt. They were hoping to settle their debts by acquiring the land, but it turned out to be owned by my mother. Now burdened with debt, my ex-husband has even lost his lover and is living alone in misery. As I move back to my family home, I'm finally starting to recover from the shock of losing my son. As my mother is also dealing with my father's dementia, I can't afford to be sad forever. I think my son in heaven would be worried if he saw me so down. So I want to stay positive about my chances. Sometimes, my dad says strange things, like today, when he mentioned that John is visiting and running around happily. I was shocked by his words, but maybe my father could still see my son. The thought that my son is looking out for us makes me believe that we should live in joy for his sake.